Well, good morning, everybody, and congratulations on surviving the dinner. Those of you who are here in mind and spirit, anyway, as well as body. Some of you may just be here in body, I don't know. I shouldn't have put that in the speaker's blurb about moving into my new house last Friday. We were hoping all this week for today. Now it looks like it's going to be Monday, but sure, that's builders for you. Anyway, my talk this morning is a bit of a change from building control. There's going to be very little about building control in it. I'm talking instead about a very different kind of build project from what most of you are used to, which is largely a DIY job in a sense, in that the people who developed this project are the people who are planning to live there. So the Eco-Village in Clough-Jordan is a very multifaceted project. It was established as an educational charity under the name that's on the screen there, Sustainable Projects Ireland Limited. We have a website there. And by the way, I've put on a lot of the chairs a brochure that was recently produced for a Near Zero Energy Buildings Open Doors event last week or the week before. There's quite a good article about the Eco-Village at the back of it, so do take it away with you. And I've got a big stock of those if anyone wants another one to share with colleagues. So what it's about, it's obviously a construction project. It's very much about sustainability, economic, social and environmental sustainability. And it's very much about building community. So you can read those three words on the slide there as a sentence or as three distinct objectives. And you'll see a lot of slides there which have lots of pictures of people in, because people is very much what it's about. It's not just technology and buildings, and certainly not a lot of control. One of the reasons for talking to you today is that there's a lot about this project which could be replicated in small towns, larger villages, and even in some sort of brownfield sites in cities as a model for rural renewal or for renewal and revitalization of communities which are perhaps struggling for one reason or another. And one thing that's common throughout, I think, almost the whole world now is the decline of rural communities as people flock more and more to the cities. So sometimes you need to take some decisive steps to reverse these flows. So I'll come back to that theme towards the end. I don't know whether it's clear on just about, I think, on the map there. You can see, is there a pointer there? The red line on the map marks the boundaries of the piece of land we bought. But the important thing to show you is it leads off the middle of the main street. So this is one of the reasons we chose Clough-Jordan. We were offered a piece of land in the middle of the village, which means it helps with integration, it helps with being less car dependent. And it was basically, we looked at about 40 sites, but this one had a lot going for it. That photograph was taken about 5 years ago when the infrastructure was complete, the roads, the drains and so on were all in. The topsoil had been stripped off the area that was going to be developed. And it's quite dated now, but it gives you an idea of where the project came from. That gives you a bit more of an idea of the settlement plan, a fairly compact development, some detached houses, some semis, a few short terraces, built to a similar kind of density as a typical village centre, about 6 houses to the acre. I was interested to read the other day in many parts of the USA, the minimum lot size is 6 acres, which means you're building at a density of 1/6 to the acre, 36 times less dense. No wonder you need a car to go anywhere. You'll also notice there's a couple of open spaces hatched in brown. The idea is that these will have live-work units, retail or craft units with apartments above, to encourage and facilitate the idea of living and working in the same place. The whole development is geared around that sort of objective. It's not intended to be a commuter town at all. We had a lot of support from North Tipperary County Council, and one very specific thing they did was when we went looking for zoning for this land, we bought it at agricultural prices, thank God, it was expensive enough anyway. They not only zoned the land, most significantly, you see the words I've put in blue there, they zoned it for a sustainable development. We think that is the only such zoning in the Republic to date, and it was a sort of strong declaration, if you like, of support for the objectives of what we were doing. Now, I won't let you waste time reading the whole of that slide. It's not particularly significant, but we certainly had great support from the council. That's an architect's drawing showing what the thing should look like when it's finished. 130 homes altogether. As you see, a fairly compact development. The normal rural pattern of a house on at least half an acre doesn't apply here. For one reason, that's not sustainable. You need so many extra miles of roads and pipes and wires and God knows what. So people want to grow vegetables and stuff like that. There's a space for allotments away from the houses, but the houses themselves have relatively small sites ranging from about 700 or 800 square metres at the largest down to about 200 square metres at the smallest. You can also see it's going to be a fairly well-wooded development, lots of trees planted around the place. And the idea of keeping it fairly compact, of course, it encourages walking and cycling around and encourages the development of community. About 50 houses are now occupied. About 5 are still under construction, including technically probably mine. They might be finishing at 5 o'clock today. There's about 20 sites sold, not yet built on. Various people, of course, because of the recession, have bought sites and then run aground with their financial plans. There's about 50 sites still for sale. We're selling them slowly. The last couple of years have been a real drought period, but we have sold 3 in the last 3 months, so we're not sure now whether that's a blip or an upturn. Time will tell. We hope it's an upturn. There's a hostel in the village. There's a lot of private enterprise projects here. These are not community-owned. There's a 30-bed hostel, the building on the left, which opened 2.5 years ago in the teeth of the worst recession for a long time and is trading well because the place gets a lot of visitors, which brings a lot of business to the whole area. There's a lot of demonstration here of various kinds of environmental good practice. You can see the little photographs on the right there, the top, a large solar array, solar thermal panels, not photovoltaic yet, the well-insulated buildings with passive solar design, big windows facing south, and lots of bicycles. It would be fair to say most of the people living in the eco-village do own cars, but a lot of them don't use them very much. I belong to a carpooling arrangement with a number of other people. There's 10 households sharing 3 cars. And we've been running this for a while now. And when I picked up one of the cars to come up here on Wednesday, I was interested to see that the other 2 cars were both already out. Quite often when you go to pick a car up, there are 3 there to choose from. So it just shows people don't need cars as much as they perhaps think they do. And when you're paying for the car per trip, per mile, it does make you think that little bit more about could you use public transport or could you share or do you need to go at all? Construction is pretty various, and this is something where the building controllers among you will take an interest. A big variety of materials, I'll say more about in a minute. In terms of construction methods, a few people self-built. A few people went to the sort of other end of the spectrum, if you like, by going for the factory-assembled jobs where the house is essentially built in a factory. The whole wall panels are put together in the factory. It's all brought together on the back of a truck and bolted together on site. So you go from foundations to roof ridge in about 4 days. And when you're building in the Irish climate, there's a lot to be said for that. But it ain't a cheap way to build. And interestingly, some of the houses that were built by those sort of techniques, which you'd expect among the best performers in terms of energy, are far from that. We can talk at some length about why that might be, but we won't, because that's not the agenda this morning. The majority of people went for relatively conventional build contracts with relatively conventional builders, people who claim to be eco-builders with more or less justification. There isn't actually an awful lot of building companies in the Republic who've got great track record and credentials in this area, so we're all learning together on a project like this. And it's true to say we're now beginning to refine our list of builders, so there are certain builders we'd recommend people to use again, and there's certain ones we just don't mention. I mentioned passive solar design. One of the features of passive solar design is large windows facing south, and you also need, therefore, to have deep eaves or a brise soleil above the window to make sure you don't get too hot in the summer. Now, it's interesting that large windows don't seem to challenge the planning system, but deep eaves do. The planners said, no, you can't have deep eaves, that's not Irish. Now, it's interesting, they allow the big windows, which allow the overheating, and they don't allow the deep eaves. It's an example, I'm not going to spend much time on it today, where I think planning and building control regulations do need to perhaps have a little bit of flexibility built in somewhere, particularly for facilitating new ideas and experimental kind of projects. It's a can of worms, but I think it has to be opened. So some of those houses they're beautifully warm in winter, but in summer it's a common problem. You hear this with these kind of passive solar designs. The south-facing rooms, which have the big windows, can be a bit too hot. Materials, there's a cob house there, which is a mixture of clay, sand and straw in the middle, the round one, with 3 or 4 cob houses. That one is a self-build. The couple who are building it, she's a civil engineer, he's a planner. They've moved in, as most people do with a self-build house, and they reckoned when they moved in it would be finished in about a year. They now reckon it'll be about 20 years before they finish it, because sure, they're comfortable anyway. Again, that's the kind of structure that can present some problems in terms of building standards, because it doesn't have a damp-proof course. They've researched the matter thoroughly, and with cob, apparently a damp-proof course is not a good idea. Don't ask me why. You'll have to come and visit and talk to them if you want to know why. They've studied the theory. I haven't. But it's a good example. They built without a mortgage. It cost them about 70,000, not counting a couple of years' labour. You know, because they're building without a mortgage and the building controls are pretty lax in the Republic, nobody's forcing them to put in a damp-proof course. But they could have problems if they were going down a more conventional build route. The house in the middle of the bottom is one of these prefabricated ones that's come on the back of a truck from Griffner Homes in Austria. Should be a very good energy performer, isn't. Top right is a house built to passive standards, isn't. Didn't qualify, quite. Passive standards are pretty exacting. There's not many passive houses in the eco-village, and I'll talk about this when I come to the heating, but the rationale for passive is somewhat lost with a heating system like we've got, so why spend the extra unless you really have a passionate determination that you want to demonstrate the potential of passive. The house at the bottom right is hemp lime. If you're not familiar with hemp lime, it sounds like it might be a traditional material. It's actually invented in France, I believe, about 1950s, but it's a mixture basically of the sort of lime that farmers put on their fields with chopped up hemp fibres. And if you're not familiar with hemp, other than as something some people might smoke, allegedly, it's the same family as cannabis, but hemp is what they used to make ropes out of before polypropylene came along. So you think of Nelson's ships with all those miles and miles of rope, that was all hemp. It's the toughest natural fibre, I believe, and bonded together with the lime, it sets into a sort of concrete-like mass, but unlike concrete, it breathes. Water vapour can go through it. We've quite a few hemp lime houses. Some of them perform quite well, some of them are a bit iffy, but they're very low embodied energy. Very little carbon is released to atmosphere in the construction of or manufacturing of the material. And a very healthy set of materials to live in. The majority of the houses are timber frame, as exemplified by the pictures on the left, but as I say, there's quite a lot of diversity. Just a few general shots of the development. The landscaping is still very much a work in progress. So you see pockets of prettiness and pockets of pretty stark areas. A lot of community activities. That was a community meal last summer, I think. And interestingly, looking at it, I thought, well, I recognise half the people there, and the other half I don't, which just shows you how many visitors we get turning up to various events, or people just visiting friends and relations, and so on. That's another cob house. This one has a timber frame, and the roof was put on at the start, so you can now build under shelter, and the cob dries out relatively more quickly, obviously, because it's sheltered. I mentioned the first couple building the cob house are a civil engineer and a planner, so you might think they know a bit about building. This is a classical musician and an actor, but they're learning a lot about building. District heating is one of the features of the project. This is quite an unusual concept in these islands, but in northern and central Europe it's very common, the idea of instead of every house having its own boiler, you have a central boiler plant. And we're not familiar with it in housing, apart from one or two fairly disastrous experiments back in the 1960s, usually local authority-led and, to be honest, not well engineered at all. But we're very familiar with it in other contexts, like schools, colleges, hospitals, universities. We have a campus of buildings with a central heating plant, and it's as straightforward as that. So you have a central boiler plant, high-quality, efficient boilers, properly managed and run and maintained, circulating hot water to all the buildings, and then the heat is metered in the buildings. So what you can see in the pictures there, at the top right, is the fuel, which is wood chip. It's sawmill waste. So we buy that. We don't get it for free. Nothing is free these days. That feeds into the same network of distribution pipes as the solar panels would if they were working. Robin spoke to us yesterday about some of the bodge-ups done by Irish builders in other contexts, where we had a bodge-up done by the installers of the solar panels, and least said about that the better, because it may well go legal soon. They've been in place for 3 years, and they still don't work. Nothing wrong with the panels, it's the way they've been fitted. And actually the faults are quite minor, because there's quite a bit of money needed to fix them. The large red building in the picture there is the fuel store. The boilers themselves are in the sort of silver-coloured building beside it. Ideally, you'd put that fuel store underground, but we didn't have the money for dealing with the local water table. So it had to be above ground. Pity really, because it's not very pretty. And the boilers look after themselves. There's no shoveling fuel in. Fuel's fed in automatically. You can see a bit of the feed mechanism there. There's a rotating rake arm that sweeps the fuel across into a screw that feeds the fuel into the boiler, and they start automatically. They clean themselves automatically. The only thing they don't do is pay the bills. Nice if they did. There's a lot of community work goes on in a project like this. The concept of the mechel in Irish means people working together with their neighbours on projects. Not only does it mean we get some jobs done without paying contractors to come in and do them, like landscaping and weeding and planting out and things like that, but we also get, it's also again part of getting to know people and developing community. Again, some more community pictures. Communal apple harvesting, and of course there's always lots of meetings with any community project, as we all know. There's no escaping meetings. A lot of educational activities. We get groups of primary school students, second level students, undergraduates, postgraduates, community groups, professional groups. We had a group, in fact, from amongst yourselves, came down last year, I think it was, about 15 of them, including a number of councillors and other people working in building control and so on, some of whom liked what they saw and some of whom were horrified. As one of the groups said, people either got it or didn't get it. And if they didn't get it, there was no convincing them. That's life. So we would definitely welcome visitors from the north to come down and see us. There may be some ideas you can pick up. We have a community-supported agriculture project. They're a community farm where people who want to pay a subscription every month for their membership of the farm. That pays a small amount of wages to a couple of people and means we get all our vegetables, milk, and a certain amount of meat organically produced and within a mile or two of home. So you know exactly where it's come from and you know exactly when it was dug out of the ground. There's a bakery, again, private enterprise job. Man happy in his work. Award-winning bread. He moved his business down from Dublin. He still supplies a few shops in Dublin as well. But most of the bread is now sold locally. And a lot of people subscribe to a bread club where they basically pay so much a month and that pays for 1 or 2 or 3 as many loaves a week as they want. So that gives him a secure income, sort of core income on top of what he sells via shops and so on. And again, he runs, you can see here, lots of sort of courses in baking and tells people about how the thing works. It's a sourdough bread, absolutely delicious. I never eat anything else myself. I get quite disappointed now if I have to buy shop-bought bread. Another picture of his, it's a wood-fired oven burning local logs, but we believe it's the only one in Ireland. There's also an enterprise centre just completed a few months ago, looking for tenants, and part of this objective of creating work opportunities on the spot, and getting away from the commuting lifestyle. And part of the idea, these other pictures there are largely illustrating things that we are thinking of doing there but haven't done yet. But a good example is to put in a commercial-style kitchen, which people can rent out, say, by the half day or the day, so that people who want to do a small-scale business making stuff for sale can do so without having the issue of upgrading their own domestic kitchen to full sort of public health standards. The project's won quite a number of awards over the last few years, and currently we've got a delegation just going off to China to represent the Republic in the LivCom Awards sponsored by the United Nations. That stands for Living Community. We had a visit from the President a year or two ago. In fact, we were asking him to become a sponsor of the project. He was very keen, but his civil servants wouldn't let him. We never found out why. Energy. I put that magazine on your desk just to illustrate, on your seats rather, to illustrate a couple of points, but the really interesting thing about the project from a lot of people, the thing that grabs people most quickly is the heating cost. The heat is sold at cost, which is 3.5 cents a kilowatt hour. That compares with oil at about 9.5 cents and electricity at about 17 in the Republic. I don't know what it is here. And the average heating bill for the year is very low because of that and also because the houses are well insulated. So with an annual bill, frankly, there will be some people spending that in a month in the winter, because some of the houses are quite large, and that's the annual bill, and it includes all your heat and hot water. Very few people have any kind of other source of heat or water heating. There's no electric showers, there's only a few immersion heaters. We also have 6% of Ireland's A-rated houses, which is pretty good for such a small group of houses. So it's quite an exemplar for the country as to how things could be done. And they hold this, I don't know whether it took place in the north as well, there was this near zero energy buildings open doors event, which is a bit of a mouthful, which is what that programme on your chairs is about. We had about 30 houses open for that event. The rest of Ireland had about 30 houses open for that event. So we're kind of pulling our weight, I think, there. And there's some very good information about some of the houses in the eco-village on that website. We're busy adding to it, but there's about 30 houses or maybe 35 described in a bit of detail there already with their energy performance details and so on. So, there's a lot about this project that could be replicated. Not necessarily exactly, we wouldn't do it the same way ourselves again if we were starting again, by no means. I often say we could write a very good book on how to plan and develop an eco-village, and we could write at least 10 books on how not to do it. You learn. But there's a lot of ideas here that could be replicated and could be applied in terms of revitalising and renewing both rural communities and urban. And this is not perhaps the most obvious thought, but a brownfield site in a city, something like that could be a very good location for something like this. And the community-supported agriculture idea, I mean, you probably wouldn't have, more than a few dozen eco-villages, at least initially. But the community-supported agriculture idea, every small town or large village could have one of those on the edge of the village. And many of us are old enough to remember when all the vegetables for a town would be grown by a market gardener on the outskirts of the town. There was no question of flying potatoes in from Egypt. Everything was local. It travelled a few miles to market maximum. And it was on the market stalls in a day or two after harvest, rather than several weeks later as we get now. That could be done anywhere. Obviously, there's been huge impacts for the good on the existing community, which, by the way, has been very welcoming. It's an interesting little town clock, Jordan. It was known locally as Little Belfast, not because of anything to do with, shall we say, friction between the communities, but because it had a very strong Protestant community. The Methodist Church was actually first there, then the Church of Ireland, the Catholics came third. So it's a much more, what should we say, open-minded community than many others, perhaps. And the impacts have included obvious things like the railway line might well have closed, and is still under threat, but it might well have closed a while ago if it hadn't had a significant upturn in traffic because of the eco-village and some pretty vocal and eloquent supporters. There's a lot more activities in the village, scouts and choir and things like that weren't there before. The fire station was threatened with closure and again was given a reprieve because of the eco-village. And there's a lot more doers arrived in the place, and that's really helpful as well. Sometimes we have to be a bit careful not to take over, but the balance is pretty good, actually. There's a lot of local activities where both old and new residents are very much integrated and working together. Tidy towns and you name it, all the rest. Shops have got more business. Shops have reopened, which were closed. Both the schools, there's 2 schools in the village, one was that were under threat of losing a teacher. Both have been extended because there's a lot of young families. A lot of visitors bringing business to the shops, the restaurant, the pubs and the rest. There's a new McDonagh Centre open. Thomas McDonagh was a local teacher and poet who was one of the leaders of the Easter Rising, so very much a local hero. The library has been extended and rebuilt, so generally speaking the place is benefiting in all sorts of ways. Now, in terms of those of you who are involved in local government might like to think, well, how could local government promote projects like this? And again, I won't even begin to go into detail now, but I think top-down, provision, most local authorities don't have the money to do this sort of thing these days anyway, and it probably just doesn't work in terms of the relationship with the people who live there and come to live there. But I think local government, I mean, the sort of way we did it as a grassroots initiative, it's huge hurdles, not only economic, but in terms of credibility and attracting people to the project when everyone says, well, it'll never work. Local authorities may be backing a project like this and sponsoring it and working with the activists could maybe really help to get things going. And I think it would also much give the projects the courage to be a little bit more innovative. For example, in ways like designing the project so there would be no cars within the eco-village. If you own a car, you keep it on the edge of the eco-village. After all, if you live in an apartment block, you don't expect to park your car at your door. A bit similar to that. And I've just alluded to this, and I won't go into details because I'm running out of time, but I do think there maybe is a need in all jurisdictions for some sort of provision in planning and building control legislation for a bit of flexibility applied in very restricted circumstances. Now, I'm not promoting a sort of laissez-faire approach, but some scope for officers in these departments to interpret regulations in a more elastic sort of way in well-defined circumstances. And I think houses built under such a relaxation would have to be sold with a clear health warning on, caveat emptor. You're buying a house here which has been built outside the standard regulations. You know what you're doing. You're taking a risk. The issues are very complex. We could talk about them, I'm sure, all day. But we do think that we may be able to help local projects perhaps in some of your areas. So do come and talk to us. There's a large array of various relevant professionals. I've listed some of them there, involved with the project, most of them living there or planning to live there. There's a lot of expertise being built up. It's not a bunch of sort of hippie tree huggers, which is, well, some of them are hippie tree huggers as well, but We only have one guy with dreadlocks, mind you. I'm afraid my dreadlocks are a long way behind me. And he's got a PhD in agricultural economics, and he's a respected correspondent with RTE and the Irish Examiner, so the dreadlocks shouldn't mislead you. But just to make the point that we do still need building control, that's the house I'm renting, built in 2006. That's the state of the insulation when I looked up in the loft. Hanging down, completely unsupported, squashed up between the collar ties, and dangling down like the Spanish moss in the Everglades in Florida. I photographed this out of a magazine, by the way, because I lost the original photograph in a computer crash, but it's my photograph. I mean, how incompetent can you get? And another one, just to make... Some places it didn't actually fall down. That's like a hammock. You also got hummocks there where it's pushed up above the collar ties, and that's just as bad, of course. It doesn't fall down, but it means the wind can whistle around it. So absolutely useless. So we're a long, long way to effective building control in Tipperary. Some of the other houses on the same estate had an even better or more secure method of putting in the insulation, actually. They left it in the bags. People looked in the loft and there were rolls of insulation up there, but none of it had been put down. At least that meant it could be done properly by somebody who cared. So I've got some literature I'm going to make available during the coffee break, including contact details. But I say if people do want to come and talk to us, the email addresses are very easy to remember. Education at the Village is probably the best one if you want to bring a group down. Or if you don't get a reply to that, just try office at the Village. I think that's about it, and I think my time is up. So thank you for listening, and I think questions will be later, would they?